What impact will the recent Saudi-Iranian Normalization Agreement have on the Middle East? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mu'in Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Ibrahim Fraihat. Dr. Ibrahim Fraihat is an associate professor in international conflict resolution at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, and previously served as senior foreign policy fellow at the Brookings Institution. His many books include Iran and Saudi Arabia, Taming a Chaotic Conflict, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2020. Ibrahim Fraihat, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you for inviting me, Mu'in. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. In terms of this agreement, what are the main points that were agreed between Saudi Arabia and Iran in terms of their normalization? And what are the key issues in the background of this relationship that we need to be aware of in understanding the significance of this moment?
Well, let's start with a very brief history, because this establishes the foundation for where we are today.
Yes.
The recent rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia started actually in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and when Ayatollah Khomeini made his statement of exporting the revolution, which was received by the Gulf neighbors, including Saudi Arabia, that Iran was planning to expand its influence in the Gulf region. And it saw of this statement as a threat to its security in the region. Now, later and after the Iran-Iraq war ended in 1988,
which was essentially bankrolled by Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states.
Absolutely. The relationship started to improve again, especially with the arrival of Rafsanjani and
former Iranian president.
Exactly, to power, which, by the way, the second important thing that we need to know about the history, in 1998, Iran and Saudi Arabia signed a collaboration agreement in areas of the economy, youth, technology, in different areas of collaboration. This also, the areas of collaboration expanded in 2001, when a security agreement was signed also between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which also advanced the security cooperation between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
And then things began to go south.
Exactly. Thank you. All this changed in 2003 with the US invasion of Iraq and the removal of Saddam regime from power in Baghdad, which was seen as an ally to the Gulf countries and a Sunni regime in Baghdad. And with the removal of the Iraqi regime in 2003, the regional order has changed, which became in favor of Iran, and Iran had the upper hand in after 2003, and the removal of the Iraq regime. This triggered...
sorry, just to interrupt you, but Iraq, which was previously seen by Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states as a bulwark against Iran, was now seen essentially as an Iranian proxy on Saudi's borders. Would that be accurate?
Absolutely, Mu'in. And actually, what we could also say that Iraq shifted its position from being a Gulf country's ally to more of an Iran ally, or even as others see it, as an Iran proxy.
Or client state.
This opened the way all for the Iranian influence to expand from Iraq to Syria to Lebanon, which was also said to be the Shia crescent, which also triggered concern among the Gulf countries. In 2015, the US signed the nuclear agreement with Iran and left Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states outside the negotiations and outside the agreement.
And at the time, sorry, but you know, the nuclear agreement was an international agreement. It wasn't a bilateral U.S.-Iranian agreement, but nevertheless, the U.S. deliberately kept its other Middle Eastern allies, chiefly Saudi Arabia and Israel, outside the picture because it was concerned that they would work to undermine and sabotage the possibility of an agreement.
And Obama at the time actually made a statement that we sorted out our issues with Iran, and it's also Saudi Arabia's turn to sort its out, to sort its issues out of, with Iran. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries were perceived this as that they were betrayed by the US, their main security ally, and that they were thrown under the bus as a result of this agreement, which, by the way, established a new era of relationship between the Gulf and the US administrations, where this long-standing trust between the two parties became questioned.
So it sounds like a zero-sum game in which any improvement in US-Iranian relations resulted in a deterioration of Saudi-Iranian and Saudi-American relations.
It turned to be a zero-sum, but it could have not been treated as zero-sum, because the US made a huge mistake of excluding its historical allies in the Gulf region outside of the arrangements. And basically what the nuclear agreement in 2015 resulted in giving Iran a free hand in the region and access to massive financial resources that Iran used to fund its military militias in the region that seemed to be threatening Gulf securities. But then this issue, the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, came to a huge development in 2016 when Saudi Arabia executed the Shia cleric Nimr al-Nimr in 2016. And that was seen by Iranians as targeting Shia community and Shia cleric, and then a group of Iranians attacked the Saudi embassy in Tehran. And of course, the result of that was diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia ended or froze at that time. And it remained as such until now, the agreement that we're talking about between Iran and Saudi Arabia that was signed in China. Now, back to your question about the main items of this agreement. One is going back to the 1998 cooperation agreement between the two countries in the areas of economy, technology, youth, and tourism, and all other aspects. And also a resumption of the security protocol that was signed in 2001 between Iran and Saudi Arabia that provided security guarantees for both parties in the region.
So it goes well beyond just an agreement to reestablish diplomatic relations.
Exactly. So it's, in addition, they agreed to reopen the embassies, resumption of diplomatic relationships, and also cooperation in the region between the two countries. And most importantly, especially for Saudi Arabia, was the clause about non-interference in domestic affairs of neighboring countries, especially, of course, in this case, the Gulf countries.
Right. As you've pointed out, Saudi-Iranian relations have for several decades been marked by rivalry and escalating hostility. What factors led each of them to conclude that their interests are now better served by normalization? So what is the context in which this agreement should be understood?
Well, each country of the three countries, including, by the way, China, has its own reasons for signing this agreement. For Saudi Arabia, now going back to the nuclear agreement that was signed in 2015, which raised serious concerns about the trust of the United States as a sole security provider in the Gulf region, because that was all was questioned in 2015. And this was actually exacerbated by the following years of the different policies taken by Trump and Biden towards the Gulf and towards Saudi Arabia. Let's remember that Biden in his election campaign said that he will be holding Saudi Arabia accountable, and that he is pursuing a whole different strategy with Saudi Arabia. So the different kinds of policies, this exacerbated the Saudi concerns and pushed Saudi Arabia to start looking for a new strategy that's based on diversification of its security partners. And in this case, of course, no better alternative for them, as it's seen, than improving relationships with China, Russia, and their neighbors, of course, Iran. So that was one major reason for Saudi Arabia. Of course, there are other reasons for Saudi Arabia. In my view, most importantly, is Saudi Arabia became fully dedicated to work on its national strategy, socioeconomic development in the kingdom, which is also called as the 2030
Vision 2030.
Exactly. And for that, Saudi Arabia needed to concentrate on its own issues and its own priorities, rather than confronting Iran and continuing the rivalry with Iran the way it was conducted during the past years. Now, for Iran, with the impasse of the nuclear negotiations with the West, and the
just to clarify, there was an impasse because the United States under Trump unilaterally withdrew from this international agreement.
Yes.
And the Biden administration, rather than simply rejoining it after it took office, sought to negotiate its way back into the agreement and impose new conditions.
Exactly. And the US administration started with Trump, actually applied what's called the maximum pressure strategy on Iran, and imposed the harshest economic sanctions ever on Iran during the Trump administration, which made it, by the way, difficult for the Biden administration to undo the sanctions or to undo many of the things that Trump established or imposed on Iran, because some of them are linked to approvals by the Congress and others, including like the cost of the measures and all of that. So for Iran, now this impasse is reaching critical points where Iran is now enriching uranium of 60% concentration, which is just 20 or 30% away from the threshold of becoming a nuclear power country when it enriches uranium.
Fissile material that could be used to produce
90%.
a nuclear weapon if Iran so decided.
Yeah, so Iran wanted to neutralize Saudi Arabia from any future or any alliance that is being built now between the United States, Israel, and the US were hoping to include the Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia. So it was very much needed for Iran is to neutralize Saudi Arabia and exclude it from this alliance that could form in the region in the case of military escalation. And they were successful, actually, in reaching this agreement, which now Saudi Arabia cannot be part of any future military confrontation with Iran.
Because of the security agreement.
Exactly. And of course, unless the terms are changed. But also there is another additional reason, Mu'in, also for Iran, which is the domestic pressure, especially on the economic level, where Iran is, we're seeing protests in Iran that we haven't seen since the 1979 Islamic Revolution.
And which have been ongoing since September of last year.
Exactly. And that Iran has been trying to crack down on these protests, but it's continuing. becoming more resilient protest, and that for that reason, Iran wanted to also to start looking at some economic return, not just the security component of the relationship with Saudi Arabia, but also in terms of developing its economic cooperation with the region. And that's again why we, part of the agreement went back to the 1998.
So would it be fair to say that from Iran's perspective, this normalization with Saudi Arabia is in part an alternative to sanctions relief, given the impasse in the nuclear negotiations?
Of course, Ma'in, because now this is also making the sanctions system imposed by the US more difficult to apply.
Right.
Because Iran now is not only expanding in terms of security and responding to the possible alliance, but also increasing its economic partners in the region. And the agreement, 1998 agreement, allows for investments, economic cooperation on all levels, which also will weaken the sanctions. Exactly.
And from Saudi Arabia's perspective, if we look to the 2019 drone and missile attack on Aramco facilities, widely attributed to Iran, was there also a feeling in Riyadh that it would be, along with its Gulf partners, a primary victim of any armed confrontation between the US and or Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other? Was this a factor that also led them to seek this agreement?
Thank you, Mu'in. The 2019 Yemeni Houthis attack on Aramco, it, in my view, reinforced the turning point between Saudi and the US that started in 2015. In 2019, with the attack on Aramco, actually revealed a huge security vulnerability for Saudi Arabia, and not only Saudi Arabia, but also its main security partner, the United States.
Because the US effectively didn't respond to this attack on Saudi's behalf.
One, it did not respond, but even equally importantly, or more importantly, that all the security contracts, the technology that the US, that Saudi Arabia is buying from the US, could not prevent such simple drone attacks by Houthi rebels from Yemen on its, like the heart of its economy. It's the Aramco oil facilities that could not prevent that. And with that attack in 2019, actually that led to the reduction of the Saudi oil production by 50%. 50%, 5 million barrels a day dropped after the attack, which severely impacted the Saudi economy and actually exposed the security umbrella that the US has provided or has been providing Saudi Arabia for many years is not able to prevent such attack. And as you said also, the Trump administration failed to respond. So in that case, this turning point that I referred to it in 2015 with the signing of the nuclear agreement was reinforced and pushed Saudi Arabia further towards the need or its need to diversify its security partners. And again, this is related to the war in Yemen that also the US administration, Biden administration, Mu'in, from the first month that he came to power, he released an initiative to try to stop the war in Yemen and removed the Houthis from the terrorist list when he came to power, with the hope that he could stop the war in Yemen and help Saudi Arabia in this case, because also it was a US interest.
Help Saudi Arabia extricate itself from what had...
And help itself, also help the United States, because the Biden administration wanted badly to get out of the war in Yemen for all the ethical reasons and for the image that has affected the US with being the worst man-made disaster, humanitarian disaster in the past decade, probably. But this failed. The US could not help Saudi Arabia stop the war in Yemen. Now, Saudi Arabia is counting on the support of Iran through the leverage it has on the Houthi rebels in Yemen to be able to help with stopping the war in Yemen. So Saudi Arabia that wanted badly to get out of this war.
So you're saying that from Saudi's perspective, there were two motives. One is the diversification of its security relations globally, and then seeking increasing stability and security regionally. And you've also talked about Iran's motives. Now, given these realities, do you anticipate a shift in either Saudi Arabia or Iran's regional policies within the Middle East as a result of this agreement? In other words, what, if any, impact do you expect the agreement to have within the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, with respect to Palestinian reconciliation? Where do you see the effect it may have?
Well, first, we in conflict resolution say that the success is not in signing a peace agreement, but the real success is in implementing this, right? So will Iran and Saudi Arabia be able to implement such an agreement? I think there are reasons to consider that, yes, to a certain extent, that they will be able, that the impact will be felt on the region and on the two parties themselves.
So you don't see this as just ink on paper?
No, I don't think so. I think the major effect that we're going to see, one is that I call it the controlled rivalry. In my book, I called it a chaotic conflict because it lacked rules and regulations and understanding about the issues of the conflict and the parties involved and all of that. I think now we're moving to—
Now it's going towards a managed rivalry.
Thank you. It's moving more to a managed rivalry. It's the reasons or the causes for the foreign policy of both countries, they're not going to disappear. And I think that's going to continue to be one of the challenges to this agreement. But I think now we are moving to more of a controlled rivalry or a managed conflict between the two parties, which is what I call in my book that this is the next step, even that precedes conflict resolution between the two countries. Why there are good reasons that we're going to see managed rivalry or reduction of tension in the region. One is that I think the two parties have the political will for the first time since 2001 that in order to pursue a different approach on both sides, Iran and Saudi Arabia. One. Two, the agreement really serves the interest of both parties, right? And we have seen this in the change of Saudi foreign policy and its relationship with the US. And now it's hoping that they can help them stop the war in Yemen, and also that can focus on its domestic factors. But more evidently, we are seeing, Mu'in, the Assad regime that Saudi Arabia fought for many years, now becoming Saudi Arabia the facilitator of bringing the Assad regime back to the Arab League. And we saw how the Saudi foreign minister met with Assad, and Saudi Arabia is using its influence to bring the Assad regime, Iran's primary ally in the region, back to the Arab League, which is expected to see some tension reduction in the conflict in Syria. It's also expected to see some tension reduction in Yemen, with now Iran can use, and this has started already, using its leverage to try to convince the Houthis to come to terms with ending the war. I think also Iraq, which has been used as a proxy battleground between Riyadh and Tehran for many years, since 2000.
And it's situated precisely between them, unlike
exactly right in the middle. I think now we're going to see more of this rivalry being reduced in Lebanon as well, to a certain extent. However, I don't think that we're going to see these conflicts, so that we're not too hopeful, Muin, that we're going to see all these conflicts disappear. Because these conflicts in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Palestine, everywhere, these conflicts have their own domestic factors that had nothing to do with Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Iran and Saudi Arabia rivalry exacerbated these elements, these domestic elements, but they did not create these conflicts. So in Yemen, for example, even if Iran used it could be able to reach a ceasefire, maybe ending the war with Saudi Arabia, but the domestic factor between the Houthis and its rivals in Yemen, like with the Islah Party, with the Southern secessionists.
Ending the conflict, you're saying, would be a Yemeni rather than Saudi-Iranian decision. Do I understand you correctly?
Yes, absolutely. It will be a Yemeni, and in Syria, it will be Syrian, right? Because in Syria also there are the refugees, there are, the transitional justice that hasn't been talked about.
So to interrupt you, Ibrahim, that's all very clear, but we've also had instances during the past decades of rivalry where you've had situations where domestic parties have been ready for an agreement, but have then been blocked by their regional and international sponsors. So in that sense, do you think we could, in fact, see more domestic conflict resolution as a result of this agreement?
This is a case by case, in my view. It's unfortunately what happened. You are right. In the beginning of these conflicts, the investment of the local parties of the conflict is not high, right? So they had a much bigger role to play in ending the war, but the regional rivalry did not help because it supported both and allowed for the emergence of the warlords and the war economy in these countries, and domestic factors also emerged, which prevented the solution of this conflict. But in this case now, it's becoming even more difficult. Like, for example, after all the investment, now we have Idlib in the northern of Syria. We have the Houthis in Yemen that are in total power. If Saudi Arabia withdraws from or ends the war with Yemen, this will embolden the Houthis and make them even much, much more powerful than their own domestic rivals, the Islah and the other Yemeni political parties, right? And also we've seen other players in Yemen, for example, the UAE, which has its own militias in the south. So it's really challenging, to deal with all these factors. And for that reason, I think the agreement that we're talking about between Iran and Saudi Arabia, it's going to help more of the management of the tension reduction, but it's not going to resolve all the conflicts, as this will require significant contribution and a major role played by the domestic parties themselves in order to be able to resolve.
But it in effect will help to reduce these various conflicts back to their core domestic dimensions, which is, I would argue, no small achievement. But
absolutely,
turning to the regional picture again, in addition to Saudi Arabia and Iran, Turkey, as you know, has also sought to establish a regional leadership role, and has had its differences with both Saudi and Iran over the years. How do you think this agreement will affect Turkey's position and ambitions in the region?
That's a very good question. Let's first see who's going to be the next president.
Can I guess?
In the next Turkey elections, because that will also depend. That will also impact if we see Erdogan being replaced by the opposition party. I think it's we're going to see as a fundamental shift in Turkey's foreign policy the way we see it. But let's assume that things are continuing the way we know them. I think it depends on the country. Meaning, like in Syria, Turkey is going to lose a major partner in Syria, which used to be Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states that were able to counter Iranian influence over the past years and support the Syrian revolution and aiming for regime change. Now, for regime change in Syria, Turkey has no partners. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf state, it's not the traditional role that we used to see back in 2012 and 13. So I think Turkey's role, presence in Syria is going to be impacted because on that level of losing the partners, and then it will have to deal with Iran and Russia unilaterally in this case.
But do you see Saudi Arabia and Iran perhaps cooperating together even informally to, for example, seek to clip Turkey's wings in the region?
I don't think so. I think Saudi Arabia is also pursuing, including, by the way, also the United Arab Emirates.
Yes.
They're pursuing more of a new foreign policy that's mainly like the zero conflict, right? That wanted to resolve their own conflicts with in the region and to try to reduce. And this is an important shift that we've seen in the foreign policy of Iran, of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And it has its own reasons, because for the past 10 years, the past decade, they pursued an aggressive intervention in several countries, in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, UAE, in Egypt, UAE also supported for a long time.
And Qatar, of course, with the crisis and blockade.
Yeah, but this aggressive policy, actually, it did not give them what they want. It backfired. Saudi Arabia lost in Syria. It lost in Lebanon. And also it's losing the war in Yemen. Right? Even in the UAE, in Libya, Haftar became close to taking over the country, but then with the Turkish intervention in Libya, UAE's partner ally Haftar was blocked. So this aggressive intervention cost them a lot of money, but no return, or almost no return. Now we're seeing a shift in the foreign policy of the two countries of more working, with the regional partners, including actually they both improved their relationship with Turkey, and also there is economic cooperation is taking place between the UAE and Turkey, and also promised with Saudi Arabia. So this is shifting, but so I don't think we're going to see more of Saudi Arabia or the UAE confronting or fighting against Turkish. But again, the loss or the impact is going to be seen as part of losing a partner or a strong ally, Saudi Arabia, for Turkey in Syria. But that's not going to be affected, for example, in Libya, right, where Saudi Arabia is not seriously intervening in Libya, or almost no Iranian intervention in Libya. So I think for Turkey, its presence or interference in Libya is not going to be hugely affected as a result of that. In Syria, it be impacted. We could see also some changes in Azerbaijan and Armenia but that's bilaterally between Turkey and Iran. Without counting on Saudi support on that level. So I think that's will depend on each file and each country where Turkey has a presence and the role of the Saudi Arabia in that conflict.
At the outset of our discussion, you made clear that the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran really only began in 1979, and it's of course worth recalling the outstanding relationship that Saudi Arabia had with Iran during the era of the Shah. But nevertheless,
Twins pillar policy.
yes, nevertheless, there has been a sectarian dimension to this rivalry, in the sense that sectarian differences have been instrumentalized and politicized and weaponized as part of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. So my question is whether you think this agreement will serve to reduce sectarian polarization in the region.
That's a very good point, Mu'in. And that's actually Obama's reasoning for disconnecting from this rivalry, that he made this, that he stated that this is an ancient conflict between, referring, of course, to sectarianism between Sunni and Shia, and we had nothing to do with that.
Yeah,
right?
as ancient as the purported eternal conflict between Arabs and Jews.
Yeah, exactly. So on that level, in my book, I argue that sectarianism does not play as a cause of this conflict. So the major cause has been security. Again, starting with the Khomeini's statement of exporting the revolution, which the Gulf countries saw of this as a threat to the existence and survival of their own regimes, right? And in 2003 with the US invasion. So it's all about security as a cause of this conflict. However, as you said, Mu'in, sectarianism, right, came as a handy point for Iran and for Saudi Arabia, for both, to use sectarianism, instrumentalize it, right, and use it in order to counter each other. And they both invested in sectarianism. It's no coincidence that Iran, all the militias are Shia majority in Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthi in Yemen, in Saudi Arabia, Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq. So this is not just a coincidence that they happen to be Shia. And also Saudi Arabia, of emphasizing the sectarian component, also would get additional support from the Sunni majority of the Muslim world to counter the Shia on that level. So sectarianism actually was used by both parties to serve their own political agenda, and they succeeded to a certain level, right, of making use of sectarianism on that level.
And Saudi Arabia has also been sponsoring and funding sectarian militias of its own.
Exactly. So on that level, I think we are seeing now that we're entering an area of a managed rivalry, right, where both countries are scaling back on the aggressive policy against each other. I expect that we're going to see this being reflected on sectarianism and also reducing sectarian tension in the region on that level. But that's not easy because these things, you know, they don't work on a button. You just press a button.
And they take on a life of their own.
Exactly, because over the past years of investing in sectarianism, we ended up with highly sectarianized communities in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq. Hatred has been built, rivalry. So it will, in my view, it will take many years, if not even decades, to undo the damage that was created to the sectarian relationships between Sunni and Shia in these countries, if we even continue with a solid policy of trying to contain sectarianism and reduce tension between the two countries. But for the short term, less or no investment in sectarian tension from the two main parties, I think this is going to reduce the tension, but it will take much longer in order to resolve it between on the level of sectarians.
Some analysts have suggested that Saudi-Iranian normalization removes the prospect of Saudi-Israeli normalization, something that had been very prominent on the agenda of both Biden and Netanyahu. But are these two issues indeed mutually exclusive? Does the reality of Saudi-Iranian normalization eliminate the prospect of an agreement between Saudi and Israel?
The answer is no. They're not mutually exclusive on that level. And to answer this question, there have been two views, right, on it. One is that now that Iran is securing, Saudi Arabia is securing the side of Iran, they have a free hand to sign an agreement or to normalize with Israel.
Sorry, and this is, of course, something in which Saudi would have been preceded by the UAE.
Exactly. Now, the other view is that no, right? Now that now Saudi Arabia normalized with Iran, there is no reason, right, to normalize with Israel. Because the whole assumption of normalization and with Israel is to counter the Iranian influence and to fight against Iran. Now that Iran is no longer seen, at least the way it was seen before, as an enemy, then there is no reason, there is no security reason for this collaboration. Now, looking at the two views, we have seen actually on the Israeli side frustration about this normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which tells us that they are seeing more the chance of normalization becoming less and less the way it was before during the Abraham Accord, for example, with the UAE, because now Saudi Arabia is not under the same pressure as used to be and cannot be easily blackmailed as was Israel planning is to do through the Iranian threat, can blackmail Saudi Arabia and get normalization from that level. So we have seen an Israeli frustration as a result of this normalization. There have been criticism to Netanyahu on the domestic level, especially from the opposition, because of his failure is to make a breakthrough with Saudi Arabia. And not only Israel, also the United States. Though the U.S. welcomed to a certain extent the agreement with the hope it will reduce tension in the region, which is one of the U.S. objectives. But also we've seen in like last month, the head of the CIA meeting with Mohammed bin Salman and expressing their frustration.
Yeah,
right?
He didn't go there to welcome this agreement.
Exactly. Expressing U.S. frustration of the Iranian Saudi rapprochement, that it's becoming too much, right, for the U.S. administration to handle. So we could, again, back to your question, does not eliminate the possibility, but I think, in my view, it's making the Saudi-Israeli normalization less and less likely. And also, we have seen just a week ago, actually, Saudi Arabia releasing one of Hamas prisoners in Saudi Arabia.
And the high-level Hamas delegation visited Saudi.
And welcomed Hamas delegation to Saudi Arabia, also invited Abbas to Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia seems to be planning something different. At least we know one thing, Mu'ayyan, to try to answer your question. The way we saw the Abraham Accord unfolding with the UAE, that kind of normalization we will definitely not see, right?
And under pressure of the radical extremist policies of the current Israeli government and statements by its leaders, we're not even seeing that kind of formal public normalization with the UAE anymore, at least at the same level. But you referred to the visit by CIA Director William Burns to Riyadh, in which it's my understanding he expressed opposition not only to the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but also specifically to the role that China played as the mediator of this agreement. And so my question to you is, what is the significance of the fact that this agreement was mediated by China, and for that matter, also that Saudi's separate rapprochement with Syria is being mediated by Russia?
First of all, let's mention, Mu'in, that the real negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia did not happen in China.
They happened in Iraq, I think.
In Iraq, in Baghdad, and later also continued in Oman. Right? But they were signed in China, and the China's role here is very significant. And China jumped on the opportunity. First of all, for the two parties, Iran and Saudi Arabia, they needed a strong mediator, right, to be sponsoring this kind of agreement. And here comes the role of China that Iraq and Oman cannot play. China was being pressured by both Iran and Saudi Arabia because of the rivalry between the two countries, that China should choose between Iran, the long-standing ally of China, and Saudi Arabia, that now it's opening the door for China's
economic partner.
Exactly. And China imports 36% of its energy from the Gulf. And also, it has been reported that there is some also military collaboration between China and Saudi Arabia, especially on the ballistic missiles level. So China is getting into this golden business opportunity, expanding in the Gulf, but this is being opposed by Iran, because Iran, the historical ally of China, is now seeing China helping, their enemy, Saudi Arabia.
So China was able to, by mediating this agreement, China was able to preserve its privileged relations with both parties.
Exactly. And that's the biggest win of China as a result of this agreement, that instead of being pressured to choose between Iran and Saudi Arabia, they brought the two parties together and kept the two parties for themselves, right? And working with expanding economically in the Gulf and also militarily with Iran. Now, in addition, of course, the Gulf has been historically an American territory, right? In terms of security and all of that. So China is getting a foot in this region that has been for decades being a strong ally of the United States. So it's getting a foot there in this traditional US ally. And China resolved it this way. In addition, of course, China is working on many levels now in the region in order to expand economically. But let me caution one thing about the Chinese role here, because there have been some analysis jumping to the conclusion that China is changing its foreign policy and playing a leading role in the international system. And I don't think we are on that level. China is still working along the lines of its traditional foreign policy parameters, focusing on the economy. And at the core of this agreement, the way I see it, it has been the economy. It hasn't been that China wants to build, to lead the world order or build new security territory for itself. I think it's too early to talk about that. Of course, the US administration sees that as a major threat of Chinese expansion in the Gulf, but I don't see that China is up to that level or as part of its own policy. We still, at least, Mu'in, we still need to see more or similar interventions by China in other conflicts or in other areas in order to build a pattern for Chinese, or a new pattern for Chinese foreign policy. We cannot build a new pattern based on this agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That, in fact, or in the core of it, happened in Baghdad and in Oman, but then sponsored the agreement to conclude that China's foreign policy is changing and it's leading or co-leading the world order with the United States. I think we need to see more indicators, but at the business level, the economic level, it has been a golden opportunity for China, and China benefited immensely economically from this level, and preserving its supply of energy from the Gulf without having to worry about this, and continue its military and economic collaboration with Iran.
Putting aside for the moment former COVID specialists who are now experts in Chinese foreign policy, it seems to me, as you said, that China was primarily driven by the motive of preserving its economic interests, and sees the US as making the primary investment in securing Gulf trade, and doesn't really want to take responsibility of this for itself. Is this a correct interpretation, or do you see China also seeking to play an even minor role in the security and stability of shipping lanes and the like in the Persian Gulf?
I doubt that China, for the short term, wants to play this security role, because
it's happy to let others bear the burden.
Has always been happy with the US leadership. Actually, the dynamics in the past, the US, it was pressuring China that they should contribute to the security burden that the US is carrying in the Middle East. And China was refusing. That China wanted the US to lead on security and secure the area for their business. That's the way China has been pursuing this. Does not want to carry the burden of the security. It's very costly. It's very costly, Mu'in, to build an empire, and to build an empire that has its influence in the world.
And it's even more costly if it's already part of someone else's empire.
Exactly, thank you. It's to clash with the US for influence and pay for that. The China has been hesitant to take even a clear role in the war in Ukraine. Now, with after 15 months being, happening in Ukraine, while still trying to balance, because China emerged as the main beneficiary of this war in Ukraine, and also historically benefited from US leadership on the security and allowing for its businesses to expand. Why would China change? In addition, in many of the conversations we had with Chinese officials and former officials, and asking them about their possible role in the security architecture of the region, the answer you get from all of them always that we have neither the interest nor the capability to play a security role. We can't do it, and we don't want to do it. Right. So that has been the Chinese position on that level, because, again, the way I look at it is that China does not want to carry the burden of the security that has been, talking about, for example, the cost of the US invasion of Iraq, talking about trillions of dollars. Is China prepared to pay trillions of dollars to play a security role? I don't see that within the current Chinese foreign policy paradigm. Right. Now, whether this will change in the region, we don't know. In the
that's
future.
For the future.
In the future, but on the short run, I don't see that this is changing for many reasons.
Finally, returning to the region, should we draw any conclusions from this Saudi-Iranian agreement about shifting geopolitical alignments within the Middle East? You've spoken about a diversification of security relations and so on, but do you see this as something, let's say, more transformational in terms of the traditional geopolitical alignments of the Middle East states?
Thank you, Mayan. Now, this will depend on the two parties' ability to implement this agreement and to truly move into collaboration and reconciliation between the two countries.
Mhm.
If they're able to do so, I think we could see new alliances being formed. We could see reduction of tension in many places. And the two countries, in terms of the potential, they have a huge potential to change the political map of the region. Now, this is in terms of potential. Will they be able to do so? I think there are serious challenges, Mayan, that they're facing the two countries. One, Iran will not give up on its own militias, not on Hezbollah, not on the Houthis, not in Syria, not in Iraq. So Iran will continue because the armed militias of Iran, they're part of its regional macro level security region, right? So Iran is not going to abandon their armed militias. So, and this will always be a threat to Saudi Arabia on that level. It might be able to contain it, but not disarm Hezbollah or disarm the Houthis or on that level. So this is a huge challenge. Two, Saudi Arabia, yes, we are seeing shifting or diversification of security partners where it used to be monopolized by the US. Can the Saudi Arabia really shift entirely from the United States? This is a huge task, at least on the military level. The Saudi army, the Saudi technology.
Would have to be entirely refitted.
It will take 2 decades for Saudi Arabia to replace its military warehouses. So it's not going, the parts for its military machines, it's going to take many, many, many years. Also, can Saudi Arabia really trust China or trust Iran even? Let's say if Saudi Arabia is attacked today, will Saudi Arabia call on China to protect it? So China's role, as we agreed, it's not a security intervention. It's a business intervention. Saudi Arabia will not call China. It will call Washington, right, on that level. So detaching Saudi Arabia from the United States, it's not an easy task. And this is always also a threat to Iran. So there are serious, really serious challenges between the two countries. To what extent, right, that they're going to really implement and move forward and move from the management, as we agreed, right, to the transformation, to the resolution, which in my view has many challenges.
So moving forward, I think what you're basically saying is we should expect more of the same, but perhaps less of it. Ibrahim Fraihat, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and insights with Connections on this very useful conversation. And by way of conclusion, the next 2 weeks will be devoted to the 75th commemoration of the Palestinian Nakba. And we have a series of 6 podcasts that will be looking at different aspects of the historical and ongoing Palestinian Nakba. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mu'ayyan. It's always a pleasure to talk and to challenge us with your excellent questions about the dynamics and the political dynamics of the region. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.